Legal Matters with Tormeys Solicitors in Athlone, and our focus today are e-scooters, and not just from the point of view of owning one and whether you are compliant with the new law, but also if you are somebody involved in an accident involving an e-scooter and you're injured, where do you stand? So the man with the answers is Declan O'Flaherty. Morning, Declan.
Morning, Will. Morning to you and all your listeners.
So let's start with what the legal regime says at the moment.
Yeah, so there's been a very big change in the legal framework governing e-scooters since May of this year, 20th of May. And up until that point, the legal framework didn't really exist within which to regulate the use of e-scooters. But now we have a very robust system in place. And, for example, the Road Traffic Electric Scooters Regulations 2024 set out a number of key rules for use of e-scooters in public places, and some of those rules are, and your listeners may or may not be familiar with these, but some of them are that a user must be 16 years or older, a speed limit of 20 kilometres per hour, drive on the left side, so same side of the road that all road users are supposed to use, and e-scooters are allowed to use cycle or bus lanes and are allowed on all local, regional or national roads. Must have a light, bell or audible warning device, reflectors and brakes, and the e-scooter must be in a roadworthy condition. So in essence, the e-scooter user must follow the same rules of the road that apply to cyclists, including traffic lights, road signs and all types of pedestrian crossings. And a few things then e-scooter users cannot do, again, if you continue on the analogy of cyclists, footpaths, pedestrian areas or motorways must be avoided, can't use or hold a mobile phone, can't have a seat on their e-scooter, which is an unusual one, and can't carry passengers or goods, which again is no huge surprise. And interestingly then, there is now a whole series of fixed charge penalty notices that e-scooter users can be subject to, and some of your listeners might find these a little bit unusual and a little bit interesting. All of them carry a fine of €50, by the way, so not the worst penalties, but still it shows you that there is a regulatory framework in place now. So for example, exceeding the speed limit, €50, failure to stop for a school warden sign, €50, carrying goods or passengers equipped with a seat, all of these things now carry a fixed charge penalty notice. And then on the more serious or egregious side, if an e-scooter user is using the e-scooter while intoxicated, either through alcohol or drugs or any other intoxicant, they can be fined up to €2,000 in that scenario. So there is...
curious, if you're an e-scooter user who happens to have a driving licence,
yes,
would your behaviour on the e-scooter impact your penalty point record, for instance?
Well, there are no penalty points under this regime. It's simply fixed charge notices and fines. But it's an interesting question you raise about the driving licence, because there is currently no requirement for this type of e-scooter to have a licence or to have insurance or to be taxed, and that remains the case. So what we're talking about here is a particular type of e-scooter, and again the regulations specify what exactly is covered by the regulations. So the e-scooter must have a maximum weight of 25 kgs, must have a continuous rated output. People with more technical knowledge than me might know what that is, of 400 watts or less, and has things like wheels must have a diameter of 200 mils minimum, etc. So there's a range of requirements there for e-scooters to comply with, both in terms of their specification and then how they are used in public places. So I think that's a positive, but it is important that people are aware, because e-scooters are, as we know now from all sorts of media, both like yourselves and social media, e-scooters are everywhere.
Does the burden of compliance fall only to the buyer, or is it illegal to sell outside those specifications?
Well, you can have bigger e-scooters, but then you move into the realms of requiring a different different type of framework. So you move towards moped style, and then you move into a requirement for insurance. So as you go outside these specifications, well then you run the risk of being treated as a full road user.
Listeners are commenting predictably about the enforceability of some of these matters, and look, that's for the Gardaí, I suppose, to decide. But where it could come before the courts, the civil courts, is when there has been an incident.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the lack of insurance, but there's still the potential for injury.
Oh, absolutely. Then there's no question. And I think as we hear from media reports day and daily, there are unfortunately tragedies involving e-scooters, and sometimes fatal injuries. Other times there can be quite serious injuries sustained. So without speaking to any specific case and talking simply in generalities, if an e-scooter user is injured due to the negligence of another road user, well then the normal rules of negligence apply there. And if it is a motorised vehicle, which is compulsorily insurable, car being the best example, well then that car must be insured, and therefore the e-scooter user will have a remedy against the car owner or driver's insurers for their injury. So if you are an e-scooter user and you are involved in an accident which is not your fault, well then obviously you should get the name and address and insurance details of the other road user, perhaps call the Gardaí if there's any indication of careless or dangerous driving, and take photographs and videos at the scene of the accident, which again with smartphones nowadays, they are very commonplace, just as dashcam footage on the vehicle involved is often seen in these cases. So it is also important to remember that just because the e-scooter has been damaged or the person using it has been injured through the actions of another road user, it doesn't mean that the e-scooter user has a clear run at it. So for example, if you use the analogy of a cyclist, cyclists should wear bicycle helmets when they're on the road, and e-scooter users are also strongly advised to wear helmets. So if an e-scooter user suffers a head injury through not wearing a helmet, well then that can go to what's called contributory negligence in the case, even where the accident is caused by another road user. So that's just important to bear in mind as well, that that there are two sides to every equation, and certainly when it comes to accidents involving any road users, the normal rules of negligence apply, and that's something that should be borne in mind.
So a recent example from me, I was in Athlone, I was crossing the street to Athlone Town Centre. It was a pedestrian crossing, and I, at the very last moment, caught this image of an e-scooter out of my peripheral vision and stepped back. But had I not done so, the guy would have hit me. We both would have been injured.
Yes.
And how would blame be apportioned, and what would happen?
That's the really interesting question in all of this, Will. And of course, Athlone is normally a very safe town. Live there myself. A very nice place to live, and all of that. But as you rightly say, there are incidents day and daily now involving e-scooters and other vulnerable road users, such as the pedestrian in your case, or cyclists, or indeed anybody else, wheelchair users. So that raises particularly interesting legal issues, because unlike the example we just spoke about of an accident involving a motorised vehicle which is compulsorily insurable, we discussed earlier that e-scooters under this new framework are not compulsorily insurable. You don't need to have a licence, tax or insurance for them. So what happens if you are injured through the actions of an e-scooter user? Well, it's not straightforward, because it's not compulsory insurable, but that is not the answer to the question. There can be, for example, insurance under, believe it or not, a household policy. So if you have a household policy and contents cover under that, e-scooters can be insured there. Now, the more recent policies written by insurers for household policies specifically exclude e-scooters, but you can arrange for your e-scooter to be added to a policy, subject of course to paying an additional premium, etc. So it is important, if you're involved in an accident, that you find out the name and address of the e-scooter user and try and make inquiries to establish if it is possible that there may be cover for that e-scooter under that person's household policy, because injuries and damage are commonplace from e-scooters.
Well, that protects the owner of the e-scooter from the risk of huge financial loss if somebody is injured. But if they don't have the insurance, and let's imagine they don't really have the means to pay out for, had I broken my leg or whatever the damage was, what happens then?
Well, unfortunately, that does create major difficulties for the injured person, because the old phrase, you can't get blood out of a stone, applies. And if there is no insurance cover, then you are suing somebody personally. Now, they may or may not have the means, most likely won't have the means, but again, that's the scenario you get into of, if there is no insurance cover, then the e-scooter user is personally liable. And as you say, if you're going to operate an e-scooter and you're using it beyond the permitted limits, or using it dangerously or carelessly, well, then you need to have a real consideration of what you're exposing yourself to. And that's the best advice I can give. Use them with care. But if you are involved in an accident with an e-scooter, whether it was your fault or not, it is important that you consider all of the avenues that are available there.
The regulatory regime is in its infancy, but these scooters have been around for a while. Is there much case law?
Yeah, believe it or not, there are cases coming before the courts all the time involving e-scooters. More often than not, it is the case of the e-scooter user being injured due to a collision with a car, but you are seeing cases where pedestrians, vulnerable road users, are being injured as a result of e-scooter usage, and they are going to become more and more common as time passes.
A comment from a listener that we've had bikes on our roads for centuries probably, and is an e-scooter any greater risk? I suppose within the limits, what is it, 20 kilometres per hour? You've got 20 kilometres of momentum coming at you, propelled by an electric motor. The prospect of injury is probably greater than a high Nelly. Well,
everything creates a risk, but it's just a case of people being conscious of the risk of anything they bring on the road, even a bicycle. I mean, if a bicycle runs into a pedestrian, we see it in the Tour de France all the time. Awful collisions involving cyclists travelling at speed and people who are watching the race or just not bothering with the race and being struck by cyclists. So you have to be conscious that anything you bring on the road or out in the public space creates a risk for other people, and it's important to be conscious of that when you're using any particular piece of equipment on the road.
Here's a great question. If the person who injures you, the driver of the e-scooter, is underage, can you still sue for damages?
Yes, and believe it or not, this comes back to this question of the household policy. If there is contents cover under a household policy and use of the e-scooter is not specifically excluded there, it is possible that the underage person's parents' household policy could cover that claim. So in that scenario, your caller should get some advice and try to establish what the insurance position is. But that's certainly a very interesting question, and I have seen that in my practice.
As a general principle, criminal liability is at 18, isn't it?
Yes.
Civil liability is younger.
Applied to anybody, anybody. And as you say, I mean, the regulations say you must be over 16, but we all know, of course, we see it ourselves when we're out and about, younger people are using e-scooters in the same way that you have some young people get behind the wheel of a car when they're not legally entitled to either. So that's human nature, unfortunately.
Declan, A lot of people, I suspect, will want to pick your brain at some point in the future over this. What's the best way to reach you and the team at Tormeys?
Well, info@tormeys.ie. You can contact us through our website, contact us through our social channels, or email us at any time. And of course, if you're like myself and you're on the old school, a telephone call is always appreciated as well.
Declan O'Flaherty, thanks for your time.